I've been with my husband for over a decade now. When I think back to the early days, it feels like we had everything. We weren't just partners, we were best friends. We laughed at the same jokes, found joy in the same little things, and even our differences seemed to fit together like pieces of a puzzle. It felt easy back then, like we were perfectly in sync. We could spend hours just talking, sharing our dreams, or staying up late watching movies and talking about the future we wanted together. But somewhere along the way, things changed. We got married in 2018, and for a while, everything felt normal, like we were continuing the life we'd built together. Then, little by little, he started to drift. At first, it was small things, canceling plans, being less affectionate, but it added up. He stopped initiating conversations about us, our relationship, or our future. It was always "I'm fine" or "it's nothing" whenever I asked how he was feeling. Whenever I brought up something that was bothering me, he would apologize, sure, but nothing actually changed. His apologies were hollow, and it felt like he didn't really care about fixing the problems. He just wanted to smooth things over enough to move on. It's not that we fought all the time. It wasn't like that. It was more like distance. Like I was slowly being shut out of his world, and no matter how many times I knocked, he wouldn't let me back in. I tried to talk about the lack of romance between us, how we hadn't gone on a real date in months, how I needed more than just routine conversations. He'd always apologize, say he'd try harder, but nothing changed. He would still prioritize plans with his friends or just not make time for us, for me. I felt like we were growing apart, becoming strangers who just happened to live under the same roof. And I didn't know how to stop it. Every time I pushed for more connection, he'd brush it off, like I was making a big deal out of nothing. But to me, it wasn't nothing. It was our marriage. The person who used to be my best friend now felt more like a roommate, a distant one at that. The spark we had, the one that made me fall in love with him, was fading, and I was terrified we'd never get it back. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if he even noticed. As the months went by, the emotional disconnection between us became impossible to ignore. I could feel it every day, the distance, the coldness, the growing gap where there used to be warmth and affection. I craved intimacy, not just in the physical sense, but in a way that went deeper. I wanted him to hold my hand, to look at me like he used to ask me how I was really doing. I needed that emotional closeness that once came so naturally to us. But instead, it felt like every time he touched me, it was leading to one thing: sex. It wasn't that I didn't want to be intimate with him, I did. But it felt transactional, like he only showed affection when he expected something in return. A kiss would quickly turn into wandering hands, and before I could even process what was happening, he'd be pushing for more. It made me feel cheap, like the only reason he wanted to be close to me was for sex, not because he truly wanted to connect with me emotionally. And that hurt more than I could put into words. I started turning him down, more often than I ever had before. I wasn't trying to punish him, but I just couldn't force myself to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. If I gave in and slept with him when I didn't feel connected, it would only make me feel more distant afterward. I needed more than just physical touch, I needed emotional intimacy. I needed to feel like he saw me, like he wanted me for more than just my body. But every time I said I don't feel like it, I could see the frustration in his eyes. He took it personally, and the rejection only deepened the divide between us. Instead of understanding what I was trying to say, he assumed I wasn't attracted to him anymore. "You're not into me, are you?" he'd ask, with this resigned tone, like he'd already made up his mind about what was happening. No matter how many times I tried to explain that it wasn't about attraction, that I needed us to be emotionally close first, he couldn't hear me. He'd apologize, say he'd try harder, but the pattern kept repeating. The more I pulled back, the more he leaned on his assumptions, thinking this was about physical attraction. And each time he made it about that, I felt myself retreating further, unsure if we'd ever bridge the gap between us. It wasn't just about sex, it was about everything we used to have that seemed to be slipping away. The late-night talks, the spontaneous moments of affection, the laughter we used to share. It was all fading, and I couldn't shake the fear that he'd never understand what I truly needed. It was like we were speaking two different languages, and every attempt to communicate only made the distance between us grow wider. The more I expressed my need for emotional connection, the more he assumed I was pulling away from him physically, and that misinterpretation only made things worse. Each day, it felt like we were drifting further and further apart, and I didn't know how to stop it. In April, I had a trip planned to visit my parents out of state. I'd be gone for a week, and while I was excited to see them, I couldn't help but worry about leaving my dog behind. My dog wasn't just a pet, she was my baby, the one thing that brought me comfort when everything else felt distant. I didn't trust anyone to take care of her the way I did, but I had no choice but to rely on my husband while I was gone. Despite everything going on between us, I still believed he'd handle the basics, feeding her, walking her, and making sure she wasn't alone for too long. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling, so I decided to set up a nanny cam. It wasn't just for peace of mind, it was for my dog. I wanted to be able to check in and make sure she was okay while I was away. When the Amazon package came with the camera, my husband noticed it and raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" he asked, sounding more amused than concerned. "Nanny cam for the dog," I said, trying to make it sound casual. He laughed, shaking his head like I was being ridiculous. "A nanny cam, for the dog? Really?" I shrugged it off, letting him think it was a joke. I could tell he didn't take it seriously, and in hindsight, maybe I should have explained it better. But honestly, I didn't feel the need to justify it. I knew he wasn't going to be as attentive as I would be, and the thought of leaving her alone for hours without checking made me anxious. Before I left for my trip, I reminded him to make sure she wasn't left alone for too long. He brushed me off, saying he'd handle it. "Don't worry, I've got it," he said, like I was being overly dramatic. I wanted to believe him, so I did. As I drove to the airport, I checked the nanny cam from my phone, just to make sure it was set up right. The camera was positioned perfectly, giving me a clear view of the living room where my dog usually hung out. It brought me some comfort, knowing I could check in whenever I wanted. I left for my trip, trusting that while things weren't great between us, he'd at least take care of our dog. I never expected the camera would catch anything more than her lounging around, waiting for me to come home. In my mind, the worst thing that could happen was him forgetting to feed her on time or leaving her alone for too long. Little did I know that nanny cam was about to show me so much more than my dog's daily routine. As I settled in with my parents, I still felt that nagging unease. I tried to shake it off, trusting him to do the bare minimum, but the pit in my stomach wouldn't go away. It was a subtle tension, a lingering doubt I couldn't explain. I had no idea what I was about to uncover. It was late, and I couldn't sleep. I had texted my husband a few times throughout the evening, just to check in. He'd mentioned earlier that he was going to a concert with some coworkers, but promised he wouldn't be out too late. By 11 p.m., I still hadn't heard from him. I wasn't worried at first, he was probably just enjoying himself. But as the hours passed, my frustration started to build. By 2 a.m., I was downright furious. My dog had been alone for almost 12 hours, and my husband wasn't answering his phone. The last text I'd gotten from him was hours ago, and now my calls were going straight to voicemail. It wasn't just about him staying out late, it was about the dog, the promises he made, and the lack of any basic consideration. I felt helpless being so far away, unable to do anything except watch and wait. Out of frustration, I pulled up the nanny cam on my phone, hoping maybe he had gotten home while I wasn't paying attention. The screen flickered on, and there was the familiar view of our living room. Empty. I sighed, angry and exhausted. How could he leave her alone for so long? My eyes kept flicking between the clock and the camera feed, watching for any movement. Then, just after 2 a.m., I saw the front door open. My husband finally stumbled through, clearly drunk, and I felt a wave of relief. At least he was home. But before I could even process that feeling, someone else followed him inside, a woman. My heart sank when I recognized her as one of his coworkers, someone I'd met in passing once or twice. She wasn't a stranger. I wanted to believe the best. Maybe she had just driven him home since he was clearly in no condition to drive. Maybe she was just being helpful. But there was something about the way she followed him inside, so casually, that set off alarm bells in my head. They both collapsed onto the couch, my husband barely able to hold himself upright. He slurred his words, babbling about nothing, while she stayed sober and calm. I could hear everything through the camera, their conversation starting off innocent enough. She talked about the concert, laughed at his drunken state, but then, slowly, the tone shifted. Her voice softened, and his responses became flirtatious. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe I was just overreacting. But then, he asked her to kiss him. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I couldn't believe what I had just heard. Surely I misunderstood. But before I could even react, she climbed on top of him, straddling his lap as he lay back on the couch. The flirting had escalated into something far worse. I watched in horror as they started kissing, her hands wandering across his body while he pulled her closer. I was frozen, my phone trembling in my hand as I watched it all unfold in real time. My heart pounded, my stomach twisted into knots, and tears welled up in my eyes. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding, this was a betrayal, playing out right in front of me. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. I couldn't call him, couldn't scream at him. All I could do was watch as the man I trusted threw away everything we had for a moment of drunken stupidity. The sickening weight of helplessness washed over me. As I sat there, glued to the tiny screen on my phone, my worst nightmare unfolded before my eyes. My husband and his coworker were tangled on the couch, their movements clumsy and desperate. The kissing, the way her body pressed into his, it wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was real, and it was happening in our home. On our couch. The same couch where we used to sit together, watch movies, and plan our lives. And now, it was the scene of my complete devastation. I could hear every word they exchanged, his drunken slurs, her soft giggles, the sickening sounds of their intimacy. It felt like I was trapped in some horrific dream, unable to wake up. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I could barely see through the tears flooding my eyes. I wanted to scream at them, wanted to jump through the screen and stop it all. But I couldn't. I was hundreds of miles away, utterly helpless. My hands shook uncontrollably as I clutched my phone, unable to tear my eyes away from the screen despite how badly I wanted to. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a complete shattering of everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my husband. I had trusted him so completely, never even questioning his loyalty. But now, all of that trust crumbled into dust, replaced by a suffocating sense of loss and disbelief. How could he do this to me? How could he do this to us? I watched, paralyzed, as her hands roamed over his body, and his hands that used to hold mine with love, gripped her waist, pulling her closer. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, and it was like the world had dropped out from under me. Panic started to rise, my heart racing faster and faster until it felt like I might explode. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But it was. Tears streamed down my face, and I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle the sobs threatening to break free. There was nothing I could do. I felt like a ghost, watching my life fall apart in real time, powerless to stop it. I tried calling him again, but of course, he didn't answer. He was too lost in the moment with her to even notice the world crumbling around him. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something, anything. My mind raced, desperate for a way to stop this nightmare. And then, in a moment of sheer panic and anger, I grabbed my phone and called the police. I didn't know what else to do. All I could think of was getting her out of my house. "There's an intruder in my home," I told the dispatcher, my voice shaking. "A woman. She's not supposed to be there. My husband's drunk, and she's taking advantage of the situation." I could barely get the words out through my sobs, but the dispatcher calmly assured me that officers were on their way. I hung up, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. A small part of me couldn't believe what I had just done, but I didn't care. I wanted her out. I wanted him to wake up from whatever haze he was in and realize what he was throwing away. And maybe, just maybe, if the police showed up, it would all stop before it went any further. The next few minutes dragged on like an eternity. I kept watching the cam, waiting for the officers to arrive, praying that something, anything, would bring this nightmare to an end. The minutes after I called the police felt like a lifetime. My body was numb, but my mind was racing, filled with panic, anger, and disbelief. I kept watching the nanny cam, my eyes fixed on the two of them, waiting for the inevitable moment when everything would come crashing down. I didn't know exactly what I expected, but I hoped that when the police arrived, reality would snap back into place, that something would finally make this nightmare stop. When the flashing lights finally appeared outside, my heart jumped into my throat. Through the cam, I saw the officer's flashlight sweep across the living room window. My husband was still on the couch with her, oblivious to the chaos that was about to unfold. Then, the loud knock on the door. He shot up, startled, his drunken daze momentarily interrupted. The coworker scrambled off him, looking panicked and confused. The officers entered, and I could hear them asking my husband if everything was all right. He mumbled something, still too intoxicated to fully comprehend what was happening, and I could hear him struggling to piece together a coherent explanation. The coworker stood off to the side, visibly shaken, as the reality of the situation hit them both. It was chaotic, but also strangely satisfying. It was like a bomb had gone off in my living room, and the destruction was finally coming into view. I could only imagine what it felt like for him in that moment, caught, exposed, and with no way out. He tried to explain, stammering that it was all a misunderstanding, that he'd had too much to drink and didn't know what he was doing. I didn't mean for this to happen, he kept saying, his voice shaky. I was drunk. It doesn't mean anything. But those words cut me like a knife. Drunk or not, he had made a choice, and that choice had shattered everything we had built together. It wasn't just a moment of drunken stupidity, it was a betrayal that couldn't be undone. Watching him scramble to excuse it all felt like a slap in the face. How could he think that being drunk was an excuse for what he had done? How could he believe that blaming it on the alcohol would make the pain any less real for me? When the officers finally left, things felt eerily quiet, as if the storm had passed, but the damage was still there, undeniable. My husband sat there, head in his hands, and I could feel the weight of his shame, but it wasn't enough. He started apologizing, over and over, trying to explain that he was upset about how things had been between us, about how we weren't having enough sex, about how he was feeling neglected. But every word he said only fueled the fire in me. I didn't mean for it to happen, he repeated. I was drunk, and we haven't been connecting. I thought maybe it didn't matter to you anymore. Hearing him say that felt like he was trying to pin this on me, like somehow I had pushed him into the arms of another woman. The anger bubbled up in my chest, and I finally spoke, my voice trembling. I've told you 100 times what I needed from you, more than just physical intimacy. I needed you to be there for me emotionally. But you didn't listen. He looked at me, guilt written all over his face, but I could see that he still didn't understand. But it's not just about that, I continued, the words spilling out in a rush. Even if things weren't perfect between us, cheating is never the answer. You could have talked to me, we could have worked through it together. But instead, you betrayed me, in our home, with someone else. And now you want to blame it on alcohol and our problems? It's not that simple. He didn't know what to say. His apologies felt hollow, his excuses even more so. I could see that he was sorry, but sorry wasn't going to fix this. Sorry wasn't going to take away the image of him with her, the feeling of betrayal that now hung over our marriage like a shadow. In that moment, I didn't know if we could ever get past this. All I knew was that the trust we once had was gone, and no amount of drunken apologies could bring it back. In the quiet after everything had settled, I found myself sitting alone, staring at the same spot on the couch where I had watched him betray me. The room felt cold, empty, like the warmth and life that once filled our home had been drained away. It was hard to wrap my mind around how things had changed so drastically. Just a few years ago, we were best friends, partners in everything, laughing together, sharing our dreams, and building a future. Now, it felt like we were strangers. I kept replaying the last decade in my mind, trying to pinpoint where it had all gone wrong. Was it when the small gestures of affection started fading? Or when our conversations became shorter and less meaningful? Maybe it had been happening all along, but I had been too blinded by love and hope to see it. We had once shared everything, our thoughts, our feelings, our lives, but now there was a chasm between us, one that seemed too wide to bridge. His betrayal had changed something in me, something I wasn't sure could be undone. It wasn't just the act itself, though that was bad enough. It was the fact that the man I had trusted with my heart had made a choice, one that shattered that trust. No matter how many apologies he offered, no matter how much he tried to explain it away, I couldn't shake the image of him with her, couldn't erase the deep sense of betrayal that had rooted itself inside me. I loved him. I knew that much. But the love I felt now was tangled with so many other things: hurt, anger, disappointment. Could we ever get back to the way things were? Would I ever look at him the same way again? Even if we tried to rebuild, would I be able to forgive, to let go of the resentment that was already creeping in? I wanted to believe we could fix this, that we could somehow find a way to make things right. But deep down, I knew that things had changed forever. What we once had, the deep connection, the trust, was gone. And I wasn't sure it could ever come back. I sat there, lost in thought, questioning what my next steps would be. Could I stay and try to rebuild something from the ruins of our marriage? Would therapy help us find a way back to each other? Or was it better to walk away now, before more damage was done? Before I lost even more of myself in the process? I didn't have the answers. But I knew one thing for sure: no matter what I decided, our relationship would never be the same again. The future I had once envisioned for us was gone, and all that was left was uncertainty.